difficult conversations and difficult conversations through leadership. I think that content that's contained in this presentation can be applied to so much of what we've learned throughout the course, throughout reading the book. In the brief time we've been able to come together and have conversations among ourselves, one true thing I believe from experience, from training, and I could give you lots of scenarios. I think managing the ability and developing the skill to engage in difficult conversations is important for us as supervisors. It's important for us as social workers. We are leaders for our clients. We are leaders for our peers and our colleagues, our families, our communities. So what I talk about here, I think can transcend to just almost anything. But I think it also goes very much back with the presentation on employee appraisals and employee termination. So much of what I take from here really it comes from my learnings from Brene Brown. I consider Brene Brown a mentor, even though I've actually never met with her. I hope someday to have the financial ability to engage in some of her trainings, but I read everything I can get my hands on that she has written, and I to her podcast, I listen to her YouTube videos, and I really take to heart and examine some of the things that she talks about. The other person that you're going to hear in here again is the person that I used in the last presentation, and that's going to be Brooke Castillo, and that's Brooke Castillo of the Life Coach School. She's a master life coach. Now, Brooke doesn't engage in her own research, but she does an amazing job of pulling the research and the experiences of so many other experts in different fields into the real world and teaching them from a standpoint so that we can apply them in everyday life. So that's why I like her. So everything from here that I'm going to cite basically is going to come from the things that I've learned through their mentorship. And I say their mentorship, I've not met them, but I think we can have mentors if we read the books and if we listen to them and if we see how they live their lives through their writings and their experiences, then that too helps to mentor us. So basically, for me, in an administrative position, whether I'm a supervisor, whether I'm a parent or volunteer, or a social worker in the front line, we're leaders. We're leaders in relationships. We're leaders like I said, for our clients. We're leaders for our families. We're leaders for our communities. And we have to have strong leadership skills. Even if we're not in a formal supervisory administrative position, we are still everyday leaders. Because Brene Brown does define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and who has the courage to develop that potential. Well, my goodness, what do we do as social workers? We look for the potential in the individuals that we work with. We look for the potential in the agencies, the organizations, the systems that we work with. And then we muster the courage that we need to help develop those potentials. So we are leaders under that definition. And becoming an effective leader is a lifelong, deliberate process. It is not inherent. I don't believe leaders are born. We learn the leadership skills, and it is so much of what we need to do as social workers in terms of our self-awareness to apply this to become strong leaders. I just am passionate about this area for what we do on a daily basis. So we have to commit to a lifelong learning, deliberate process to grow into leadership. Again, I've come to the belief that leaders are created, they're not born. And they're created through a variety of circumstances, and some is through our purposeful engagement to develop the skills to become leaders. So we have to invest a great deal of time in self-awareness, in our personal growth, developing these skills, and to find the potential in people and then to help develop that potential. That's what we do as leaders. That's what we do as supervisors. That's what we do as CEOs of companies. That's what we do as founders of companies, is we are investing in the growth of not only ourselves, but the other individuals who we are leading. So, we're going to talk about difficult conversations. And difficult conversations become difficult because they can be charged with a lot of negative emotions and negative thoughts. And I bet we engage in difficult conversations almost every day, and we do it off the cuff. We don't do it deliberately in a way so that it can have some form of positive outcome. So that's what we're going to talk about today is some of this self-awareness, some of this vulnerability, some of the courage that we need to engage in the difficult conversations and talk about different contexts of when these difficult conversations happen. One of the contexts that we'll talk about is who is right. We're going to talk about going into a difficult conversation and not having to be right. We're going to talk about having difficult conversations in terms of uncertainty and scarcity. And my goodness, aren't we in a time of uncertainty and scarcity right now with the COVID pandemic and everything that's happening there? We're also going to talk about difficult conversations that surround cultural norms and differences. And we'll talk about inclusion, and we'll talk about in diversity and some references and some resources that are available to help us have the difficult conversations we need to have surrounding these areas. And again, in this time in our society, we need to be prepared and engage in those difficult conversations. If we do not, we are not being leaders in our own lives. We're not being leaders in our communities. We're not being leaders in our families, and we're certainly not being leaders in our profession. Then we're going to talk about feedback versus feed forward, and I like the concept of feed forward, and I'm going to explain that when we get to that, because again, that can be an empowering way to have a difficult conversation. So we have to talk about required foundations that are necessary to engage in the difficult conversations so that we can have positive outcomes. Sometimes it's hard for our brain to wrap around the fact that we can have a positive outcome when the situation is difficult and challenging. But the reality is, the actual reality is, we have more growth from the difficult, challenging situations than we do from the everyday easy situations. So if we are in pain, if we are uncomfortable, if we are experiencing some form of anxiety related to engaging in a conversation, those are all opportunities for growth, for personal growth. So they're not necessarily negative aspects, because that's how we do grow professionally and personally. To be able to engage with others so that everybody is served in that conversation is we have to have a strong foundation of self-awareness. We have to understand and develop skills in empathy. We have to have courage, and we have to make space for vulnerability. Those are 4 key areas that we need to work on daily in leadership as we grow. And in doing that, it will be less likely for us to avoid a difficult conversation. We'll be able to engage in a difficult conversation and arrive at some type of comfort level with the topic that we've had. Let's talk about our self-awareness. In self-awareness, and we teach this in social work, and oftentimes when we think about self-awareness, we think about boundaries and we think about awareness of our biases and things like that. But really, self-awareness has to do with being conscious of our thoughts and why we're choosing to have those thoughts. And if we take this from the standpoint that when we have a thought, it is a choice. It is our choice to have a thought. That thought then is going to create our feelings. Whatever we think about a circumstance, it creates our feelings. And our feelings and our emotion therefore drive our actions. And then when we take action based off of our feelings and our emotions, we end up with some form of result. Sometimes it may not be a result that we want. But unless we go back and really become consciously aware of what our thoughts are, we may not understand the outcomes that we're getting in our lives. And so this is one of the first areas as a leader that I began to work on. And for the past 3 years, I've engaged in almost daily work in terms of being conscious of where my thoughts are and the feelings that they're creating and what actions that I may be taking. Because again, our brain just runs amok oftentimes with thoughts that are embedded from our childhood that we don't even think about anymore. We have a belief and we feel like it's true, because it's been presented to us so much throughout our life that we've never brought that thought to consciousness and really looked at it and examined it. But it does impact our life. So as a leader, this is one of the biggest areas we really have to work on, and it's our self-awareness. So let's talk about some examples of that. So here's an example, and we'll talk about through how this might play out based on the thoughts that we could potentially have. As a supervisor, I must talk to a staff member about problems with the work that is being produced. So I need to talk to somebody about the quality of their work. There were several reports that were submitted that were late, had numerous errors, and resulted in a directive to me from my boss to clean this up. We often know that these communications happen in email, so let's just imagine that on a Friday afternoon I received an email from my boss that sent reports back to me that I had forwarded on that somebody had done at my request with the directive, clean this up. Wow, how could this play out? Because if that's what I get, and we know email's not a great communicator anyway, that's a whole nother recording to talk about. But anyway, if I have this directive to clean this up, well, how can this play out? Well, first of all, we're going to examine what the facts of life are. And the facts of life are just that. They're the facts. They're the circumstances. All circumstances in life are neutral and defensible. The grass is green. We've identified the word green to describe the color of the grass. The grass in my yard is green. That would be defensible, and it's neutral. There's no thought, there's no feeling related to that. However, if I have the thought that my grass looks like a pale green and it might look sick, that becomes that's my opinion of it. Somebody else could look at my grass and the color of it being green. We're going to agree it's green, but we may not agree on what the meaning of that green is. I may see it as being sick and I need to fertilize it, and somebody else may see it as being a really pretty green. We have to determine what the facts are of a situation. We have to remove all those thoughts that we have that create the emotions and get to just the neutral facts if we're going to begin our self-awareness process. So in this particular situation, several reports assigned to be completed by a specific staff member were submitted late and had errors. That's the fact. That is totally defensible. There was more than one report that was returned to me. These reports have been signed to a specific person. They were submitted after the date that they were requested, and there were multiple errors in them. So there's no arguing that. There's no emotion to that. There's no meaning to that. That's the facts, okay? My thoughts about that is then what gives it meaning. And that drives how I engage in a difficult conversation or if I avoid a difficult conversation. So I have to be able to separate out what is the facts here and what meaning am I giving these facts before I can move forward and take action. Otherwise, the action I take may be fueled by a meaning that I'm giving it that could be very negative and have a very negative outcome. So I got the email, clean this up. So my first thought could be when I read the email is my boss thinks I'm not managing my department, that I'm incompetent. That's what my brain could tell me first of all when I read that. Oh my gosh, they got to think I'm incompetent. I'm not managing my department well. So that's going to create a feeling of inadequacy in me, of being inept, of fear, maybe being embarrassed. It's going to create some defensiveness in me. I need to prove something. Because the meaning I gave to those words, to those facts, was that my boss thinks I'm not managing my department and that I'm incompetent. Or I could give it the meaning, I can't be a manager. I can't even have my employees do their jobs right. Now I've put that back on myself. I'm thinking I'm a failure because the employees that I'm supervising haven't even been able to do their jobs right. So therefore it's my responsibility. And again, that's going to make me feel incompetent, less than, like a failure. I could become defensive. I could become angry. I could lash out at the employee. I can blame somebody else. Or I can turn it in on myself and I can say, oh, I'm through with this. I can't do this anymore. I can't take responsibility for what everybody's supposed to do. I can't keep up with this. So the meaning that I'm giving to the facts again, is generating my feelings that are going to result in some actions. Or I could have the third meaning in my brain, and it could say, the staff member did not complete the reports correctly on purpose, did not want to spend the time necessary to get it done, and did this to make me and the department look bad. So I can actually assign a meaning where now I'm a victim. I'm a victim of my staff member. They did this on purpose. Oh my gosh, they did this to make us look bad. Why would they do that? So then I become angry, resentful. I want revenge because I've assigned all of this meaning to the simple facts. I know nothing else other than reports I'd asked the staff member to do were submitted later than the date required and had errors. That's all I know. But you see how I can give it so many different meanings? And depending on the meaning I give it is going to be how I approach it when I engage in that difficult conversation. So this could go south rather quickly. So if I have the feeling and I'm of inadequate, inept, fear, my superiors, people above me think I've dropped the ball. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe I'm not showing up for work. They think I can just have all these stories in my mind because my brain is going to fill in all these gaps. And if I don't bring those thoughts to consciousness, then I'm just reacting off the feelings those thoughts are creating. I could avoid the situation and fix it myself, apologizing to my boss for the errors. So when the reports come back to me, I just go in, I just fix it, I clean it up, and then I send it back to the boss and say, I apologize, and then I just ignore it, it goes away. I can rationalize the problem, meaning the staff member has had a lot of personal difficulties lately, wasn't able to focus on the project. I can make excuses. This is what's happening. I'm just going to go ahead and fix these, apologize to the boss, and send it forward. And again, I don't address the issue. I can overcompensate, and I can become a tyrant. I can go to the employee, demand the report be redone right now, provide a script for exactly what needs to happen. I need you to correct item number 1, number 3, number 5. Have this done within the next hour and send it to me before it goes forward. So I can actually become very tater-like and do that. I can belittle the staff member for not performing. Okay, if I'm having these thoughts, I can belittle them. I'm like, what do you mean sending this up there like that? Why didn't you come to me first? So I can blame them. Or I could discuss the situation with a peer to seek validation that the staff member is not a good worker and that other departments have worse leaders. Because I'm looking for confirmatory bias out there to justify me being angry, being a victim, being resentful, wanting to get revenge. And so I call up my peer, who's a peer supervisor in another department, and I'm like, oh my gosh, can you believe what happened to me? And I tell them this story, and I just vent and rant about it, and then they let me know, oh, well, that's nothing. Let me tell you what happens in another department. So see, all of that comes back to addressing the feelings I'm having because of the thought that I put into those very neutral circumstances. Very neutral circumstances. I could have had different thoughts about it and had different outcomes. But this is what's going to happen if we're not aware of the thoughts we're choosing to have and why we're choosing to have those thoughts. We often think we're at the effect of our brain, but actually our brain is our tool and we can make it think whatever we want to. It just likes being efficient, so it likes to think things through. It likes to think things that it always thinks, and it likes to protect us. So it's geared that way. It's geared to protect us. Things happen if we're not conscious of what our thoughts are. The brain is always back there working to protect us. And in this situation, this brain is like, oh my gosh, they're going to come and get you. You've got somebody who turned something in, and you're going to lose your job, and it's that person's fault, and you need to take care of it. So our brain is kind of running amok, kind of running around like a 2-year-old with unsupervised with knives. So this is what I talk about when I talk about self-awareness and how important it is. We really have to separate facts from the thoughts from the meaning we're giving those facts, which is creating our emotions. That's the first step in being able to engage in some difficult conversations and have some positive outcomes. Let's go back to the actions. So the first action, I avoided the situation. I fixed it myself. I apologized to my boss for the errors, and I never said anything else. The report is completed and accepted. The problem's not addressed. I have an immediate relief that the situation has passed, but it doesn't fix the actual problem. So I'm down those emotions that I had where now the boss is going to think that I am inept, and now I'm going to have to overcompensate, and I'm always going to be on top of something. So I haven't dealt with the thoughts I was having and why I was having those thoughts. That's comes into the process. But the outcome here is there's an immediate relief that the situation is past, but I've not dealt with it, so it's going to raise itself again, those thoughts that I have. Rationalizing the problem, that the staff members had personal problems. When I tell this story to my boss, it deflects the responsibility from me and justifies the problem. Again, it's an immediate relief to that problem. Problem solved. Okay, I let the boss know, I'm so sorry, this individual has had some personal issues in their lives and they weren't able to focus on this. We've got this corrected. We're moving forward. So again, I minimized the whole situation and I've not dealt with the thought I was choosing to have. I can overcompensate and become that tyrant. So then the staff member's dehumanized. That can result in anger, defensiveness, and despair on their part. The report's completed and resubmitted, but it's a very tense environment. So now all of a sudden, I feel like I need to be watching that person. They feel like they're being watched, and so everybody's under a microscope. That happens if you belittle the staff member for not performing. It's the same thing. And then if I discuss the situation outside with somebody else, if I call them to vent and I discuss that situation, you know what? That breaks trust. It breaks trust. If I show up and discuss these issues, I demonstrate that I cannot be trusted to maintain information and that I will throw anyone under the bus. So even though I call that peer and I have a conversation with that peer about this, when that peer hangs up, in the back of that peer's mind is, wow, I wonder if she would do the same thing to me. If I ended up with a situation and would she call somebody else and tell them about me? So that breaks that trust. And it kind of goes back to, you don't want to be a bully. The playground, like Brene Brown says, if somebody's picking on somebody else, it doesn't mean we're all safe. We're only safe if nobody's picking on nobody. But you have to build that trust. And in building the trust, you want to make sure you don't share stories that aren't yours to share. And if you're actually going to vent to somebody, this is something that I've adopted probably in the last year, is we always tell ourselves it's okay to vent. It's okay to vent. We have to get these emotions out. But the truth of the fact, we're getting the emotions out. We're talking about the emotions, but we're not talking about the thoughts that are fueling that emotion. So there's still those seeds there that are planted that are going to continue to grow. So now the rule for me is if somebody wants to come to me and vent, not necessarily about another person, I typically don't allow that. I do allow venting about a situation. Then we're going to process through it. Yes, you can come in and you can vent, but we're going to process through that and why you're experiencing the frustration or the anger or the helplessness or whatever it is you're feeling about that, because we need to get back to those thoughts. We need to bring those to awareness and see what we're thinking. I don't let others come and vent or complain about another person unless that other person is going to be present. That's only fair. Now, somebody can come to me and tell me that we've experienced a situation and there's concerns that this other person is not completing their reports on time or fabricating it. That's something that could be investigated. But if there's just some type of personal complaint there, that should not be allowed without the other person being present, because that just creates drama and gossip. So again, having those difficult conversations, not only do you need to have self-awareness for yourself and understand how that works, but then you need to be able to teach others that skill also, so that you can always work through some of these challenging situations and not have the drama and the gossip that will blow everything up. So now let's talk about empathy skills. Again, in social work, we teach empathy skills a whole lot, but I'm not sure we actually really communicate or really teach what empathy truly is. Number one, empathy is not sympathy, and empathy is not minimizing or fixing the other person's experience. And we're going to talk a little bit about what I mean by that, because I think empathy skills are more difficult to create and develop than we think. Empathy is a huge part of what we do in social work, but again, just like becoming a leader, it's not inherent and it's not natural. It's something that we have to be deliberate about to develop. So we must take empathy and we must translate it into specific skills that we can learn and practice, okay? We have to distinguish empathy from sympathy. Those are two different things. And we have to understand the barriers to empathy. When we truly have empathy, it's truly not about fixing. It's about the courage to be with someone in their darkness, not to race to turn on the light so that we can feel better. And again, this comes from Brene Brown, and I love that concept because we get very uncomfortable around other people's pain. Let's say the situation happened with me and I've called my peer and I'm angry and I'm hurt and I'm fearful and I'm devastated. My boss thinks I'm an idiot. Oh my gosh, I can't do a good job. Instead of that person just being with me and being with me in that negative moment and saying, yeah, things like that really suck. Yeah, I know you work hard to supervise, and when something like that happens, it can really set you off. Instead of just being with me, the tendency for us is to fix it, to say, oh, that's nothing compared to what happened over in this other department. Okay? Well, that actually minimizes my experience, and it tries to fix the emotions that I'm having. If we're truly having empathy, we want to be capable of being with the other person in their darkness, and again, not rushing to fix it to turn on the light. Another example of that would be when a child comes home from school and a bully's been picking on them, and they come in and they start crying because the bully's been picking on them, and mom says, oh my gosh, no, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Let's come in here. Let's have some candy. Let's don't cry. Because the crying and the hurt that child is feeling is actually making mom uncomfortable. Mom doesn't like to see their child hurt or feeling that. But instead of allowing the child to feel the real feelings they're feeling and helping them process through that and say, yeah, wow, that's scary when somebody picks on you, or that really does make you feel helpless when somebody picks on you. We rush to turn on that light. We want to fix it for them. And we want to fix it for our friends when they're hurting and when they're in pain. Let's talk about just experiencing the empathy and not minimizing what they've said. Oftentimes we'll say, oh, I know, I've been there. I know, I've experienced the same thing. I know exactly how you feel. Well, you've just now minimized their experience. So empathy is important. It's a hard skill to develop because we have to have that self-awareness about ourselves, and we have to recognize and have the courage to be with whoever it is while they're in pain, because maybe it's creating pain in us. It's making us uncomfortable. But we don't want to just fix everything. We want to allow others to feel what they feel. As good leaders, we want to make tough people decisions and be tender in implementing them. So empathy is not connecting to an experience, it's connecting to the emotions that underpin that experience. Maybe you have never had the experience of being terminated from a job. You're a supervisor, you've never been terminated from a job before, and now you're having to terminate somebody. So you've not had that experience, yet you can still have empathy, and you can be with them in the feelings that they're having and the darkness that's there. Because if you've experienced grief, if you've experienced disappointment, if you've experienced shame, if you've experienced fear, loneliness, anger, if you've experienced any of those emotions, you're qualified to have empathy for another person. You may not have experienced the exact situation that person is having, but you've experienced that emotion. That's what it means to have empathy, is to understand what it's like to feel loneliness, understand what it's like to feel shame, understand what it's like to feel fear. That's empathy. It doesn't have to be related to the exact experience. To have empathy skills, we have to see the world as others see it. We have to have that perspective taking. Okay? So we have to have an other-oriented perspective. What are they seeing? What are they feeling? We have to be non-judgmental. And this is a big one that we really have to bring our thoughts to the forefront, because we have to be non-judgmental, because what our brain's going to do is it's going to say, well, if you've experienced the same thing, we've experienced that, we didn't react that way. So we can be judgmental in that. We don't want to be judgmental. We have to try to understand the person's feelings. And again, if we felt the feeling, even not in that situation, we know what it's like to feel that feeling. And we just want to be with them in that feeling. So we want to communicate our understanding of that person's feelings. That's going to require some fluency in feelings. That's going to require some fluency, some emotional intelligence. There's been some research done, and when individuals are asked to identify emotions, most of the time we can only bring about 10 words to describe our emotions, and that's a high number in the research. And there's thousands of words to describe emotions, so we don't always have that fluence, that literacy to be able to communicate in a way so that they know we do understand what they are feeling at that time. Okay, we need to be able to identify it, name it, and talk about experiences related to that feeling. And mindfulness. We need to see the mental health, the awareness of thoughts and feelings. And again, we have to be aware of what our thoughts are in these situations so that we're not judging, so that we're not minimizing, so that we're experiencing the empathy and not the sympathy for somebody. We need to learn to ask good questions of the other person. As a supervisor, if you're in a difficult conversation with somebody, we need to have good questions. If we can ask good questions of the other person and ask good questions of ourselves, our brain goes to work to try to figure those out. So we need to ask good questions. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what you want to do. Or what do you want to tell me? So we have to think of good questions. And oftentimes before we go into a difficult conversation, it is perfectly okay to write out a script. You may not stick to that script. That script may make you more comfortable, but it will also give you cues so that if you do find yourself in a situation where your brain is kind of taking over and you're having all these emotions, you can go back to those cues that you've come up with and you can have some good questions to ask. Tell me why this is so scary for you. Tell me why this is so anxiety producing for you. Tell me why this is so sad for you. Again, try to take in some of those words that are used and ask those questions and ask them to tell that from a perspective, from their perspective, so that they can use words to give you what's going on in their brain and in their mind and in their emotions. We also have to recognize boundaries. And again, in social work, we talk about boundaries all the time. These are things that are very common to social work practice, but we truly have to be deliberate to develop skills in them. And first of all, we have to maintain our boundaries. We can't take responsibility for the other person's emotions. Those are theirs 100%. So if I'm in a conversation and I'm having to talk with a staff member, and because they're not meeting their job expectations or because they have created a hostile type of environment, when I have that conversation, I need to have that conversation with them, again, clear as kind, being very painting it done, all of that kind of stuff that we talk about so that they truly understand what we're talking about. But whatever their emotions are, those are their emotions. I have no responsibility for the thoughts that they're having about this situation and the emotions that that is creating. If I attempt to control their emotions because I am uncomfortable or I don't have the courage to be with them in those emotions, whether it be anger, whether it be sadness, whether it be despair, whatever that is, then I have totally lost the battle with empathy. I've totally lost the battle with my own awareness. I cannot control another person's thoughts or feelings. And if I try to behave in a way or approach that person in a way that's going to do that, then it's not going to be a good situation. The other person is allowed to be pissed or sad or surprised or elated or scared. Now, their behaviors have to be acceptable. I do not have to accept any behaviors that would not be appropriate in a conversation, but they are allowed to experience the emotions that they experience. And I have no control over that, nor should I ever try to control a situation, to control another person's emotions. We just can't control another human that way. We try it all the time, but we just can't do that. If their behaviors come to a point where it's not acceptable, then we set those boundaries. And those boundaries would be, I know this is a tough conversation, and being angry is okay, but yelling is not. So I'm going to need you to reduce the volume of your voice. Again, separating the behaviors from the emotions, and definitely all of that from the person, the individual themselves. Others people's emotions are not our jobs. We do not control their feelings. So anytime we need to have difficult conversations, we need to have that conversation with ourselves. We can't avoid a difficult conversation in an attempt to control somebody else's feelings. We just can't do it. So what we want to do is we want to agree to practice empathy, develop the skills for empathy. We're going to screw it up from time to time, and then we need to circle back, clean it up, and try again. And that's perfectly okay to do as long as we're continuing to learn from every incident. We're not going to get it right 100% of the time. If we think we are, then we need to go back to our thoughts and figure out why we're having thoughts of superiority over other individuals and why we're choosing to think that. So we need to agree to practice sympathy, screw it up, circle back, clean it up, and try again. The other thing we have to do, and again, this comes from Brene Brown, is we have to save space for vulnerability. We want to avoid zigzagging. We don't want to zigzag and avoid the situation and avoid the conversation and not be direct and not be forward. That takes a lot of time and energy and focus to avoid a difficult conversation. So we don't want to do that. We want straight answers. We want the truth. That's what we want for ourselves, and that's what we need to give those that we're in leadership positions for. So we need to hold space for vulnerability. And what that means is vulnerability is about showing up when you don't know what and you can't predict or control the outcome. Okay, vulnerability is the courage to show up, to engage in that difficult conversation when you can't predict or control the outcome. You're not going to predict how that person's going to be able to react in that conversation, and you can't control the outcome. Remember, we don't control the other people's emotions. That is theirs to have. That is theirs to own. So it becomes scary. It becomes scary when we enter into a difficult conversation and we don't know how this is going to go. But we have to save space for that vulnerability, and we have to have that courage to show up. Courage doesn't exist without fear. So we're not going to be courageous unless we're afraid of what we're going into. And it's okay. We need to embrace that and be vulnerable. Because if we don't expose ourselves to the fear, we don't develop courage. So in my earlier examples, if I avoided the situation and fixed it myself because I was afraid of what the outcome might be with that staff member, I wasn't embracing courage to show up in vulnerability to have that difficult conversation. So courage creates our capability. It's courage that creates our capability to be able to engage in difficult conversations and able to go into those difficult situations. And we use that capability then to create our confidence. If we're waiting to have confidence first, to then have courage to do it, we've got it backwards. Courage, we build our courage to go into those situations. And as we go into those situations and we're able to embrace the vulnerability and know that we can't always control the outcome and we certainly can't always predict it, but we have the skills we need to go into those conversations and manage them from a human perspective, a healthy perspective, allowing the other person to experience the emotions that they're going to experience, allowing the other person to have the thoughts that they're going to have, and maintaining the facts, trying to keep refocused on those facts, then we're going to develop confidence and we're going to have more courage to go into those difficult conversations. And we may have less fear moving forward to them. Vulnerability is always important, and it's always important to embrace that and to save space for that. But in those terms of difficult conversations from a leadership perspective, those feelings of fear and vulnerability may begin to subside as you gain your confidence because you've employed your courage to face those things. So courage is simply showing up when you can't predict or control the outcome. That's what it is. Courage is a value. If you embrace courage, then you embrace the fact that you're going to show up to be the best you can be, even when you can't predict or control the outcome. So when conversations are negative, difficult, negative emotion, okay, let me back up. When conversations are difficult, Negative emotions surround those topics. It's just a given that the two things go together. One of the things in times of uncertainty and scarcity, and right now in the pandemic, we are in an unprecedented time of uncertainty and scarcity. As leaders, we need to be working extremely hard to make connection with those that we are leading, to provide them with the information, difficult information at times, that they need to have so that they can have a sense of calmness, a sense of knowing what's going to happen. So we have to recognize that we're going to be feeling uneasy, we're going to be feeling uncertain, we're going to have all these thoughts in our head. Okay, we don't want to inflate it, we don't want to fan it, we don't want to fake it, we don't want drama around it. But we need to embrace that uncertainty. Yes, we are in very difficult times right now. We don't know what's going to happen next week, next month, next spring. Our brain is trying to go back in history, in our history, and give us some confirmation bias about what to expect, but it may not be accurate. We don't know what to expect. So we fact check. We need to fact check the stories that our team is telling themselves or making up about this, because when we don't have all the information that's available to us, we're going to invent the stories, and I guarantee you it's always a worst case scenario. And I could give tons of examples of this. So right now we need to fact check the stories that our members of our team are telling themselves, and it could be about our workplace, it could be about the COVID-19 pandemic itself. It could be about the future of the workplace, our job security. There could be a whole bunch of things. So we need to be providing a constant flow of true information, with the understanding that the information can change at any point in time. So again, we acknowledge the discomfort. We acknowledge that there's a lot of hullabaloo. We don't want to fan it. We don't want to fake it. We don't want to inflate it. We want to acknowledge it and say, I will provide you information when I have information so that you know what is happening. Then one thing I want to talk about is feedback versus feed forward. And again, this is one of the concepts that came from just kind of a casual comment when I was listening to Brooke Castillo. And she said, in school, wouldn't it be awesome, instead of giving feedback, if we gave feed forward? And I kind of changed my perspective a couple years ago on that, because it made total sense to me. Oftentimes when we receive feedback, it's an end. We end it right there. We don't take it and use it to grow forward, because sometimes it's semantics. Sometimes it's just the way it's presented. You did this incorrectly, and we had to redo this project because it wasn't done correctly. Instead of saying, the next time we tackle a project like this, you need to have it done in this manner. So instead of focusing on what happened in the past, focus on how we can change it to happen in the future. Such a minor change in the tense that we present information can make a huge difference. If I get feedback, or if I give feedback, it may be received as, okay, that's an end, it's all, it's said, it's done, it's over with. But if I give feed forward, the next time you do this, let's see this happen. The next time you do this, let's see this outcome. If we concentrate on that feed forward, then it becomes a process of growth. It becomes a process of, okay, I didn't get it just right this time. I need to do this to move forward next time. It becomes a process of, from the school perspective, if a student has scored below the acceptable points on a test, you needed a 70 to earn a grade to pass the test. Instead of telling the student you failed the test, they got a 65, then it can be, you know what, you're almost there. You have 65% competency in this knowledge. You just, 35 more percent, and you're just right there. You've got this. You're going to be competent in it. So you're over halfway there. So moving forward, how can we develop that knowledge so you can show that competency? Sounds a whole lot better than providing a test back to a student and saying, well, you failed this one. You didn't do it. You didn't answer questions 7, 10, and 12 exactly right. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't do that. You see how that is? It's all said and done. It's over with. Versus, okay, I'm almost there. What do I need to get there? Small change in semantics can make a huge difference moving forward. And this can happen with individuals we supervise. This can happen with our children. This can happen with our spouses. This can happen in our community. If we just kind of adopt this feed forward as a leader instead of a feedback scenario. And again, feedback often takes the form of providing input, instruction, constructive critical analysis, at a time after the job is done. So when the tough conversation happens, then it needs to be, let's move this forward. How can we do this and do this differently? Next time we do this, we need to accomplish this. So it's always a constant forward gyration. And I mentioned this previously, but I love this, what Brene Brown, and she talks about what does done look like? Did I paint it done when I initially described what I wanted or needed for the task? This is one that, again, I've worked very hard on, and this is an area I still have to work a lot on, because when I ask somebody, I need to have you do this for me, I give them a brief overview of it, and I just think they're supposed to read my mind. Well, why don't you know? You know me. Why don't you know how I want that done? That's unfair. That's totally unfair. So you need to paint it done. What is this going to look like when it is done? Okay? So that way the person who is doing the task will, number one, know when it's done and know what your expectations are for when it is done. You also want to take the time to explain the why behind the strategies, how this task job assignment links to those ongoing priorities or missions of the program, the texture and the meaning of it. This is very important. So sometimes we get a directive from above us, from an administrative standpoint, we get a directive, and we're just told to do it, and we don't know why. We don't know the why. You just have to have this report to me on Friday afternoon, and we don't know what they do with the information. You're not going to have as much invested in that if you don't know the why behind it. And you might not know, if you don't know the full context, it could be that you could provide even more in-depth and more realistic information because they may not know what they're asking. So when you're providing assignments or explaining job descriptions to individuals or asking individuals to take on a task, it's very important to provide the texture, the meaning, the context, the why behind it. Number one, you get better buy-in. Okay? Sometimes it's as simple as it is a regulatory requirement that we do it this way. This is what the policy says. This is why we have to do it this way. I'm sure they have their reasons behind it, but for us, it's just because we have to do it this way. That occasionally happens. But if you can provide the context and the why and link it back to that organization, those missions, those objectives, those goals, this is why we do it this way. Number one, it gets more buy-in. And number two, it allows for creative thought processes in case we need to change the way we do things. We have to understand the context and the reason that we're doing it that way in case we have to change it. The other thing, clarity, kindness, and hope. You want to stay clear and kind when you talk to somebody. Okay? Being clear is kind. Setting forth the expectations in a way that they can understand it is kind. You practice the courage to say what you mean and mean what you say. And you cultivate hope. The goal, the pathway, agency, individual agency, because we don't want despair. Despair is the belief that tomorrow will be just like today. And right now in our society with the pandemic, there's a lot of despair out there. So we actually need to come back and say, let's do some of this feed forward. What do we want to have accomplished at the end of this year to say we came out of the pandemic with this? Is it a new certificate? Did I complete a class? Did I write an article? We need something for moving forward to know that tomorrow's not going to be just like today. And giving someone a way out with dignity. We always want to remember the human and pay attention to the feelings. So if we're terminating somebody, there's no reason to beat that dead horse about why we're terminating them. We actually need to give them a way out with dignity, even if they're being involuntarily asked to leave the agency. Another area where we work to have difficult conversations and sometimes aren't successful at it, especially when we surround ourselves with issues related to cultural norms and differences. And this is the diversity and the inclusion aspect. And as leaders, Sometimes we don't do a good job of this, and we don't model a good job of this. We're afraid of saying the wrong thing. We're afraid of offending someone. Dolly Chu wrote a really good book. The Person You Mean to Be, I think that's the name of it. I always get confused on it, and I've read it more than once. But talks about and gives some really good examples of how we can actually engage in difficult conversations when it surrounds cultural norms and differences, and not offend somebody, but also learning, always learning, knowing that sometimes we may say something wrong, but we circle back, we clean it up, we correct it, we do better the next time. The other one that we want to talk about is when we go into a difficult conversation, it's so easy for us to go into the difficult conversation to be right. So we want to think about who is right when we're going into a conversation. It's very easy for us as humans to actually always be insisting that we're right. It's hard for us to actually say, I didn't have that idea coming in here. I was wrong in my thoughts. I was wrong in my judgment. It's very difficult for us to say this. So when we go into a difficult conversation, we want to have all of our facts there, and then we want to be always knowing, well, no, I know that I'm having this conversation with you because I'm right, and this is why I'm right. We want to go from always knowing to always learning. We want to shift from wanting to be right to wanting to get it right. That's what's going to be important in difficult conversations, is not going in there with the concept that I'm going to be right, because then we get into a defensive posture and it can become argumentative. Having to be the knower, having to be right all the time, Brene Brown says that's heavy armor. It's defensiveness, it's posturing, and worst of all, it's just a huge driver of BS. So when we go into a conversation, again, we want to go back and look at what we've talked about so far. And we've talked about empathy, and we've talked about vulnerability, and we've talked about courage. We've talked about being self-aware of our thoughts. All of this goes back into the fact that when we go into this conversation, we don't have to go into it to be right. We have to go into it to sit next to the person, to be ready to hear what they have to say, to be ready to engage with them about what they have to say. If we're constantly thinking about, well, I'm right here, I'm right because of this, and I'm right because of that, then the conversation is not going to go anywhere. There's going to be a wall. So here are some just techniques about the conversation in it. So let the other person tell his or her story. Why are they right? Make sure you fully hear them, okay? This does not mean you're going to receive the same luxury from them. That's okay, all right? But you want to hear their story, and in their story, you want to hear their thoughts about why are they right? What makes them correct? Simply pull out those facts of life. Pull out the facts that both parties can agree on. The grass is green. Is it a pale green, a sickly green, or is it a bright green? Does it need fertilizer? Skip all that. Just look at the facts that both parties can agree on. The simple facts. And then identify the meaning making that's happening here. I can own it. I'm making these facts mean this. The story I'm telling in my head is this. You're making the facts mean this. And this is why we disagree. Then talk in solutions, brainstorm solutions, find a solution that both of you can agree on. And the goal is to find a solution that makes life better than before the problem. So again, that moving forward. How do we move forward? Let's don't focus on the back, on the previous, let's just focus on the forward. I think one really good technique here too is we don't want to spend so much time on the problem. We want to spend time on the solution. So we have to get at this number 3 here, the meaning making behind the facts. And it's actually very, it can be very neutralizing when you actually say, the story I'm telling myself in my head about this circumstance is this. Okay, so this is the story I'm telling myself in my head. Is it accurate or is it not? You're making the facts mean this. That's what makes it right to you. This is what makes it right to me. So we need to find a solution based on just the circumstance. What's the solution here? And that will move us forward. That will make the situation better. Again, having this conversation as a leader You may not get the same courtesy from the other person, and that's okay. You want to model this, you want to set the tone. When just one person doesn't have to be right and can actually go through this process, it will change the outcome of the conversation. The self-awareness, if I don't do my work first, I will most likely take action from a reactive mode. So that means I have to do my work on my thoughts first before I go into these conversations, so that I don't go in there blaming, expressing frustration, being defensive, justifying my stance, I'm in the right. Again, I have to think about my thoughts. That's that metacognition. I have to think about what I'm thinking and why I'm choosing to think what I'm thinking about this circumstance. My being right, as Brene Brown says, exhibits a false sense of power. If I'm always right and I hold that power over you, then the human instinct is to rise and to rebel and to resist. So we have to get over going into a conversation to be right. And sometimes this is the hardest thing to do when we're talking about doing it with our family and our loved ones and our spouses. I don't have to be right. I don't have to be right. I can choose the thoughts that I'm thinking about the circumstance, and that's right for me, but that doesn't mean that's going to be right in that circumstance. My spouse can choose the thoughts they're thinking about the circumstance, and that's what's right for them. So we have to arrive at a solution that we both can live with, but it's not of I'm right and you're wrong in many situations. So the value awareness is very important, and we want to operationalize our values and we want to practice them daily, because then that will bring us into building this skill set to engage in these difficult conversations. We are going to engage in difficult conversations throughout our whole life. And as leaders, we want these conversations to be productive. We want them to have good outcomes. Just because they're difficult doesn't mean that they have to have bad outcomes. So we want that value awareness. So think about your values, actually the values that you want to live by, and practice daily. Two of mine, or actually my two values, and again, I think it's Brene Brown that takes you through this exercise, and she says you have to pick just two values, and all the other values are going to fall under those two values, but there's two values you live your life by, and what does that mean to you? And mine is courage. I always want to choose courage over comfort, okay? So I want to show up for people in pain, and I don't want to look away. I want to lean into that vulnerability by saving space for all emotions and not buffering. And buffering means instead of experience the feelings that I'm actually experiencing, I'm going to eat that pint of ice cream. I buffer with ice cream, or I buffer with a Netflix marathon, or I buffer with, I'm a reader, so maybe I'm going to lay in bed all day and read and not experience the feelings that I'm experiencing. I'm going to show up as my authentic self and be willing to rumble. Rumble is a term that Brene Brown uses. And so that means I'm actually going to show up and be willing to have the courage to face situations that are going to lead me into that vulnerability, and that's going to require me to examine my thoughts, and it's going to require me to have difficult conversations. And I'm going to always hold the assumption of positive intent. So I'm going to have the courage to not assign in my head and my thoughts a negative perception or a bias of another individual based on the behavior that they've done. I'm going to look for the positive intent. I'm always going to hold that assumption of positive intent. And sometimes that's very hard to do. It's a constant, deliberate choice that I have to make. My other one is perseverance. I value never quitting on what is important. So my two values that everything else in my life falls under is courage and perseverance. Under perseverance, I honor accountability and not blaming. I'm going to honor adding marbles to my jar, and this is my trust. And trust is built in small increments. Trust is not built by showing up and saying, trust me. It's not built in a big action. It's built in those little ways every day where people can learn to trust you. And by not sharing somebody's story that's not mine to share, I formulate and build trust with individuals that they know I'm not going to compromise their confidentiality or their trust in me. And I'm going to replace hustle, trying to prove, perfect, perform, and place, with doubling down and doing hard. If you're a people pleaser, you're always trying to prove yourself, you're trying to perform, you're trying to perfect things. I like to say I'm a perfectionist in recovery. Perfectionism is actually simply a defense mechanism to not lean into courage and vulnerability. So I've arrived over the last 3 years at saying these are my two main values that guide my life. And as a leader, underneath these two values, the things that we have talked about, I can fit under there. And so I constantly want to take a deliberate approach to being able to lean in and have those difficult conversations and be fair to the individuals that I actually have a responsibility to lead. So I hope this has been helpful for you. It does kind of complement the presentation related to termination and employee appraisal. To me, it all kind of goes together. You can refer to Brene Brown and Brooke Castillo for the difficult conversations because that's where I've drawn a lot of this information from.